Hi everybody and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your faithful host James, and I have a returning guest today, Mr. Gerald Clark. What a super interesting guy this today's author is, and if you haven't heard the previous show with Gerald, you got to check it out. It's so detailed and so prolific. One of my favorite shows to date. We covered his first book, The Anunnaki of Nibiru. It's prolific in its research, well written, well rounded, so detailed. We're going to talk about his second book today, Mercury, a seventh planet, Mercury Rising. Just let me tell you a bit about Gerald if you're not aware of Gerald Clark. He's a graduate of the University of California, San Diego, and he holds an MSEE in electronic circuits and systems. He's a BS in computer engineering. This is all pertinent to what we're going to talk about today. He's the author of several papers in communications and electronics field. He's well known for his work in the San Diego high technology industry, and he's awarded several patents in the free space optical laser communications field. During the years 96 to 2002, he worked as a telecommunications executive. Gerald's business travels took him to various parts of the world, exposing him to a plethora of cultures, which then acted as a catalyst for his research into mankind's earliest technologies and accomplishments. These include the cultures of Mesopotamia, surrounding areas then also of Turkey, Egypt, Persia and Iraq. And this eventually led to the Cuneiform inscribed tablets left to us by the Sumerians, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Of course, Gerald's interpretation, his own subjective experience of his research is just so prolific, and he has a gift of intelligence to break all this down and relay it to the readers, the viewers, and the audience today. So without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Gerald. Welcome to the show.
Hey, James. It's really great to be here with my Irish-seeking brother.
Oh, great to have you back on the show, Gerald. Wow, here we are with a new book.
Yeah, I actually said on the back cover, I said, this is the book you and I have been waiting for, my introduction. And truly, I didn't see myself as a writer for the last couple of years. I was an engineer in transition. You know, I wrote a lot of technical stuff, but I didn't write for the lay public. It was all technical. Mm-hmm. So this book to me made me really feel like I was finally in a place where now I'm a writer and I'm enjoying it.
It always intrigues me, Gerald. It always intrigues me to know what makes that person become an author. What makes them pick up the proverbial pen as such. You know, what's the initiate to make them...
It's funny you bring that up. I was reading just recently about the nature of inspiration and how it's been viewed through generations. You know, where does it come from? Why is this person inspired? Right? They used to think it was inspiration only came from the gods in the ancient cultures. So writers and musicians that were inspired to create were attributed to their relationship with the gods. And it's funny. What I was going to say about being a writer, some people write continuously. They're publishing continuously to a magazine or what have you. But for me in this space, it's been very different that when it's time to write, I get inspired. Otherwise, I'm corroborating or whatever I'm doing in the back of my head, but I'm not writing. Mm-hmm. So I have to get to a place of clarity where it's ready to come out. And it doesn't happen overnight for me. It just, when it happens, it's like a fire hose and then it just comes out. so I'm kind of a intermittent writer that way.
I know exactly how you feel, Jerry. You know,
do you?
And that's the thing. I wanted to mention your engineering background because the engineers are creative people. They see the world, they take what the physicists tell us and they put it and they create things with the physics and they create things with the science. And, you know, they have an explosion of creativity and as well as the logical, technical, analytical mind as well. You know, so that's why I wanted to mention that background you have, Gerald. It's very unique that we have somebody like you in the alternative history genre, if you think that's fair to say.
Yeah, definitely an anomaly in this space. You know, for 20 something years, I was a hardcore engineer, everything from, you know, low level design as a design engineer, all the way up to running engineering teams for 7 years. So I kind of seen it from all different angles. And it's been an interesting path, especially when I look back retrospectively and see how certain things now impact what's coming out of my book. It's almost like it was crafted together by some grand design for this message to come out. And I think that happens to a lot of people as writers. They're essentially mouthpieces for a broader message, especially if the message is, of this nature.
I think that's a very key thing you said there, John. There is a message in this book. It's a very, very big message, Gerald, and it's an important message for humanity.
It surprised me as well. So when you write the way I do, it's kind of interesting. It's almost like people who do automatic writing. They put their pencil down, they write a whole bunch of stuff real fast, and then they look at it and go, "What just came out?" When I write, oftentimes it's like that.
For sure.
When I start writing, that's it. It's like I've been given my bread and water, and I'll sit there and get it done. And it goes all hours of the day and night. And by the time the smoke clears, after this book took me just under 4 months.
For sure.
I was well over 700 pages, and I culled it down quite a bit to get to 588. But
wow.
So for that to happen in such a short period of time, by the time I did that, then recorded the audio book, and many sleepless nights. And I let it get cold for about 3 days, and I started to review it for editing. I didn't recognize a lot of it. I was like, wow, did I write that?
Wow.
So for me, it's an inspirational process that is an unveiling to me as well. It's very unique and it's fun.
Sure. The thing I want to mention for the listeners, Gerald, I got the pleasure of reviewing the Kindle, and I got the pleasure of reviewing the audiobook. And let me just tell this to the audience. To review the audiobook was an absolute joy, because all the work of reading was done for me. And not just that, that I could buy any audiobook and just listen to it, that's fine, but I never get the audiobooks of the books that I want. I mean, there's audiobooks on the internet, yes, but to get an audiobook of alternative history, and to get one that the author has read himself, which, by the way, I want the audience to understand that when you hear the author who wrote the book or write the book himself, you get his emphasis, his intonations. You get the passion that he has, and that came through so much, Gerald. That's what I was waiting for. I was so excited with the audiobook when you
I did that on purpose, because I had the opportunity to hire a professional narrator to do it, and I'm going to redo my first book now that I'm more of less of a hack at getting rid of noise and all that kind of things. I've learned the tools after being in this space for a year, so that's next on my list for anybody who's listening. I just redid the edition of the Anunnaki of Buru with the nice paper that I had in this one, and so on and so forth. So it's getting a facelift right now, totally.
Sure.
Okay. And so that's gonna be really good. That book is still selling very well all around the world.
The thing is, there's a lot of I don't know many Anunnaki authors there is out there, if you want to call it that genre, Anunnaki authors. But for all the Anunnaki authors out there, a lot of them, they just regurgitate a bit of material. They don't put their own spin on it. I think it's very subjective to you, this whole Anunnaki history, Gerald. You take it from an engineering and a scientific perspective, and you go, hang on a minute. This is the history we've been given. Okay, let's go to the records. You take this then, and you explore the profound cuneiform writings for what they are. You take the scientific engineering insight that you have, and you apply it, and you go, well, and you break it down with clarification and verification, Gerald. It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
You like engineering tables, don't you? Everything's got to be there put in a table. Actually, there were more tables in my Anunnaki of Nibiru book than there were in the second book. From all the planet mapping to the names and the Enuma Elish to the zodiac changed. Sure. The God table. Actually, that God table turned out to be a real eye-opener for people, just like it was for me. Mm-hmm. Once you see a name that crossed multiple cultures and it went thousands of years, it's either a carryover name or the real being lived that long. And when we found out these beings were mortal for all intents and purposes, it changes a lot.
Sure. People who haven't read the book, The Anunnaki of Nibiru, Gerald, let's warm up with the show. Let's talk about these guys. What is Nibiru, the planet, and then maybe just tell us who the Anunnaki were. And also we will refer to the other show we did on the Anunnaki of Nibiru. But let's warm up and explain who these guys are.
Yeah, we'll do a warm up, and I want you to understand what I did with this book, whose perspective I took. So you cannot kind of understand, and then you'll understand how my perspective of the Anunnaki.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw what Sitchin did in terms of identifying the Enuma as a very seminal document. That if you could understand that, you could probably have a much better understanding of what's going on in our solar system now, if it was true. So I did a deep dive on the Enuma Elish and translated that for people. Of course, there's 11 tablets, so there's a lot of data, and it's very complicated to count.
Mm-hmm.
But through that process, I kept noticing the earliest names that were showing up and the ones that were also perpetuating all through the Sumerian documents. And there were some key players, okay? So I kind of looked at those, and Sitchin had said, okay, well, Nibiru is the 12th planet. It was an invader planet that came into the solar system. If you're counting from the outside in, why wouldn't you count it number 1? They made it number 12. And so there were some telling things that Sitchin pointed out. So, but the idea of affiliating 12th with their planet and the 7th with our planet, that never left me.
Mm.
And I'm like, yeah, this is the 7th. But look at all the symbology with 7s. You know, there were 7 chakras, 7 colors of the spectrum of light that we can see from 4 to 700 nanometers. It goes on and on and on. Okay.
Sure.
So 7's a pretty magical number.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And from that standpoint, he wrote a book called The Lost Book of Enki to give the perspective of this ancient pioneer who was on this planet doing what he did. Seminal book. And I, for some reason, got guided to take the perspective of the second geneticist that upgraded us so we could procreate. And that was Ningshita. And he showed up in the Sumerian account of the Enuma Elish. So let's kind of do, who are the Anunnaki? What did they tell us? And how do we get to this perspective from this being who had many names? Ningshita, he was called Mumu in the Enuma Elish,
Mm-hmm.
and several others. So let's back up a little bit and put those names in context so we can go forward.
Sure.
But what I want to drive home is through the entire book, I decided to take the perspective of this being that showed up in the Enuma Elish that looked like he was used in a benevolent way for mankind, just as Enki was. Okay? So that ought to help understand how I approach this. So that said, who are the Anunnaki of Nibiru in my first book? Well, apparently 450,000 years ago, they had atmospheric problems on a planet that had been caught into our solar system, a trapped planet that perturbed the orbital plane of Neptune and Uranus. And our scientists later on discovered this. So this is how science got focused on what happened to the edge of the atmosphere. Well, in their Enuma, in this account, they left Nibiru and came to the Earth to get resources to help protect their atmosphere. They were having problems with solar radiation as they came in close perihelion with the sun. They're in a retrograde orbit, very long elliptical orbit that takes 3,600 years to complete. Now, if you know anything about elliptical orbits, they sometimes deviate by plus or minus up to 50 years, depending on what's going on out in the deep void of space as they're traversing through this. You know, there's various levels of parasitic drag that might happen. So think of a dust cloud or something that's slowing down the travel of the planet. You don't know. So they came to the Earth to get gold as the resource. And they had a long, brutal pioneering experimentation to get the resources, put the infrastructure in place, and try to do this massive undertaking. And the reality is, you stop and think about this. If you got a problem with your atmosphere and you're putting something in it that shields you when you come in close proximity to the sun, well, you're probably going to have to keep redoing that because it's going to be peeled off by any incursions from meteors or anything else that's disturbing this. It's not going to stay forever. So they knew they were going to have to keep redoing this. And I think ultimately, knowing that, they knew they were fighting a losing battle. Their planet had been caught in our orbit. They were doing what they could to keep the radiation levels and the environment livable for them. But I think ultimately they knew it was a losing battle. So using their planet in retrograde orbit, meaning it's going in the opposite direction around the sun of all the other planets, that's weird. And it's not going around on the same solar ecliptic that the rest of the planets are. It's at a very distinct angle. So the fact that they gave their planet symbols and names alluding to a planet of crossing makes sense to me now. Okay, so they come here 450,000 years ago, try to get gold. They end up having a labor shortage. They didn't bring the tools to do heavy mining, and they seem to have a deference to using biological entities to do their bidding anyway. So if you do the math, according to how long it was before Noah's flood came, they were in those mines for 176,000 years mining before a revolt happened. They were called the Ajiji, and they were down in South Africa, and we know where their mines are now. Okay, they're owned by the Anglo-American Mining Corporation, and then the new ones up in West Africa and Ghana have been sucked up by the Viking Mining Corporation. Mm-hmm. So the outsiders that were affiliated with gold have known this story a long time. All right, so they revolt out of the mines after a very long period. They get replaced by a chimeric creation from Enki and his half-sister Ninhartsog. They were council members. Enlil was in charge at that point. He was the Lord of the Earth, or Lord of the Air. And so think about him as a bureaucratic commander, and Enki was this wild-eyed scientist like Frankenstein. So the bottom line is Enki found a life form on the steppes of Africa, and I believe it was Neanderthal. Sure. Mixed his genetics with it. It was a female. In vitro fertilized Ninhartsog, his half-sister and the medical officer who had her headquarters in Shrupak, same place Noah was king. And they produced a baby. And this baby couldn't procreate initially. And that's where our next hero comes in, and that's Ningshita. He shows up, does the analysis, does a genetic upgrade to the Adamu and the Eve, and then they're taken up to Eridu, Enki's first city that he built 450,000 years ago. It was still there, even though he was down in Africa. Well, that was where his temple complex was. So they went up there to determine if they could procreate. This was the famous Garden of Eden story. Enki and Enlil were the two beings in the garden. The snake, caduceus geneticist, was Enki that got demonized. And his brother was Enlil, who promoted himself as God and threw everybody out of the garden and had editorial oversight over the Sumerian documents that ended up as the Torah, written by Hebrew priests held in captivity in Babylon. Okay, so they were placating Enlil with their story in this. So that led us to the Atrahasis account, which is seminal, and I hope everybody's had a chance to read that. Because in there, we have our creation account, sure, our destruction account, because after 600 years, Enlil decided to wipe us out with plagues, cutting off the food and the whole thing. And also in that account, we have the biblical story of Noah as he's encountering these Anunnaki. Well, now we know that Noah, Atrahasis, who is Zeus-Sudra, also known as Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, was Enki's son. And you'll see that in my genealogy table. And it also shows up in the Lost Book of Enoch in the birth of Noah. You realize he was born with blonde hair and blue eyes and freaked his father Lamech out, who went to look for an answer how it is his wife, Atanash, just had an alien child. It's a fascinating account. Anyway, so these Anunnaki are here mining gold. They have a revolt. They get replaced with a primitive worker 220,000 years ago, and that's us. So moving forward in time, the Sumerians knew all of this information and acted in accordance with this in their culture, wrote about it, knew they were genetically created, and they were there to serve their gods. All of them that were enthroned in the Mesopotamian temples, multiple ones, not just one. Well, it turns out there was a council of them that was very structured with 6 males and 6 females. And that's what I put in the God table of my book. So if you know those names, you can start seeing where they started using AKA names in other cultures. And that's where I really got my head spinning around, was following one of those out of the Sumerian account that showed up in Greece and Rome. And this was Isis, by the way. And she tells you all her names through the various cultures, and all of a sudden this starts becoming real, that even though the cultures were separated by thousands of years, these were the same beings. And that's hard to get your arms around. Okay. So now we've got this primitive worker. They make another deal with the Anunnaki when there's just a few of them left. This is Noah and his family on Mount Ararat. And then from 12,000 years forward after the last ice age, when this big flood came, that's when the book Guns, Germs, and Steel was so seminal to me, because it talks about the culture from 13,000 years forward. Well, that's the time when they restarted culture after the last ice age, and it started right in the Fertile Crescent. So I started following that story forward. Okay, so we did all that in the first book, and then we ended up realizing those names that we brought forward were also affiliated with symbols that we're seeing in world governments everywhere. And and some of them are part of this New World Order push that's pissing everyone off, stealing their freedom and their rights.
Sure.
At the same time, there was this concept of a new Atlantis. Well, what does that mean? And you had to go back and find out about the old Atlantis to see what that means. Well, it turns out they're happening at the same time. The old Atlantis is coming to rise because it's time, but the New World Order forces that are opposed to it are at odds. So now, if you fast forward from where we were in the Anunnaki of Buru, you can look at what's going on in the world between Israel and the Palestinians, between the Americans and the Russians, and all of a sudden you realize there's a father-son team here that's spanning different cultures, and they're running things. What are they doing? Well, there's destruction in the headlines. So who were they? Well, it turns out this concept of creation and destruction is intense. We know that in the physical universe, there's a homeostasis, both whether it's with the kingdom, phylum, all the way down to the class, order, species, and variety of animal life, but also in the heavens. You've got black holes that are able to consume anything and turn it back into energy. Mm-hmm. So, in general, what I'm saying, creation and destruction are always happening simultaneously, and they have to be in balance.
Sure.
You with me?
I'm sure.
But I never applied that to the energy of man. So now all of a sudden you're seeing massive populations and massive destruction where humans look like they're getting erased like the pawns. Well, this is nothing new. So this really is disturbing to me to see this happening. And this was part of my catalyst to go back and find the thread through all of this to understand how this level of creation and destruction can be happening in man's path. Mm-hmm. And this took me all the way back to the creation of man, when Enki described taking a being as he was creating the Adapa. And I don't normally do this, but because of where you are, James, I really want to do this with you.
Sure. Go.
He decided to take the essence out of one of the fellow gods, and I believe it was one of the Ajiji, and he named who it was. His name was Yahweh, okay? And it's not to be confused with the being Allah that's mentioned earlier. That was Nanar Sin, okay? This being was killed. And then during this ritual, he essentially coaxed the essence, the countenance of the being, and put it into this new body. And then through this ritual, he essentially pulled a Frankenstein right on spot, infused the energy into this being, and gave them intelligence. And because of the genetic code that he gave us, he specified, and you're going to have a lifespan maximally of 120 years. That's amazing. Wow. Think reverse exorcism, essentially. Right? Instead of a priest and a cross throwing this energy out of a body, saying this is not welcome, he's doing just the opposite. He's coaxing the energy of this one into that one. We're not talking about going through, going to heaven and having to wait in purgatory, all this stuff. No lawyer present. Energy from this one to that one. Boom! Done.
I think
that is a level of control over energy and matter that's either complete science fiction, or you're looking at a being that is able to operate dimensionally beyond the hologram that we're in. And he just created an avatar right in front of you. Mm-hmm. A energy container, a meat host, that he can decide what energy goes in.
Genetics is the key to all this,
Wow.
Gerald.
Wow.
I mean, genetics
Yeah.
is the key. I mean, genetics explains the longevity of these people. It explains the different...
I think genetics mixed with the physics that illuminates how matter is glued together
the carnation
is really the ultimate. If you can figure that out, how matter gets stitched together, you could see how objects are made in the simulator that we think are real.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're going to get to this, and I don't want to jump the gun, but that's the part I've been so focused on. Probably because of my deep dive into photonics at Light Point. I mean, this was where physics met the marketplace. We were trying to get communications to work with photons, through the air. And we learned a lot about the nature of light. And I think that was important in understanding what came to be in this book for me in my disclosure. Probably one of the most important pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So how is matter composed from the energy? E equals mc squared. We get that. But so let's keep that in the back of our mind as we go through this. This very important creation account from Enki is seminal in his understanding of energy and matter. I mean seminal. You're looking at the creation of the first Avatar. Think of all the movies, The Matrix, the Avatar, and Hunger Games, and all this where they're talking about this holographic, okay? Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of open that up with you at the front, because when you ask the question, if the Anunnaki created mankind, who created them? Now you're looking at a being who created Enki that has this kind of capabilities, and this is where the unveiling happened in my book, and it's so magical for me as well. It solidified in my mind what the truth was, and I was so excited I wanted to share it.
For sure.
So I hope I answered kind of the background of the Anunnaki, and we can real quickly do the key players' names, and I'm going to do them slow so that people who are listening can be on page.
We need to do that.
Okay. Yeah. So we got Anu, who was the king, ranked 60 on the council. He was back on Nibiru. Okay. And not to leave out the feminine side. Okay. There was Anu and Antu, his wife. And she was known as some very ancient names in Turkey, like Sybil and such, but that was his wife. Mm-hmm. His first son was born between he and his actual wife, Antu, and that was Enki. He was the oldest. He was the firstborn. And you can see that in my genealogy table. Okay. But because of Anunnaki rules, the person that's in line to rule comes from the father and his half-sister. Anu's half-sister was Ki Urash, U-R-A-S-H, and she's in the genealogy table. Anu had a son with her, and his name was Enlil, the second born. Well, he was destined to be higher ranking than Enki because of that birthright rule. And it has to do with the contribution from the mitochondrial DNA from the female to perpetuate the purity of the genetic line from these Anunnaki. Okay, that's why they did it.
They did that in Egypt too, Gerald. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's still going on in the world in places. It's quite interesting. So, and when you understand that it has to do with the female's mitochondrial DNA exceeds the male's when it gets contributed, that the maternal archetype can be perpetuated, and they knew that. Okay, so we got Anu, we got Enki, and we got Enlil. One other birth came from that relationship, and that was Enki's half-sister, and that was Ninhartsog. So she's the daughter of Anu and Ki. Now, why is the name Ki important? Well, it turns out that's a Sumerian name for Earth. So this being took on the name for Earth, and her other name was Urash. Okay, so getting used to the idea of having multiple names when they live so long, it's hard to wrap your arms around, but it's how it is. Okay, so you gotta have a table to look at to keep from this being name soup. And as an engineer, when I was reading all these names through all the accounts, I was overwhelmed too. That's why I did a genealogy table to get it all straight.
Ninhartsog, she was the mother goddess, yes?
Well, yeah. So she was for Enlil, but not for Enki. Okay, so now we got Enki, the scientist, Enlil, the bureaucrat who's in line to rule, and then Ninhartsog, who's both of their half-sisters, who's the medical officer, who is Isis. She becomes Isis in Egypt. Okay, she's the mother of all of humanity because of this act that happened in the Atrahasis. Okay, and she calls herself that, and she's always known that. And the people that were in the ISIS cults knew that too. Anyway, so now we've got man created, man enslaved, man destroyed in the Atrahasis. I mean, brutally, with disease and everything else. And of course, the destroyer was Enlil there. Okay, that was his job. So Enki looks like creator, always the creator. And unfortunately for Enlil, and maybe they switch roles, he plays the destroyer role. So if you're an Enlilite, you're usually hooked up with him to take down things that they don't want. Mm-hmm. Okay, and you'll see this through the book, in particular in the Lamentation of Ur, where he did it to one of his own sons. Okay, mm-hmm. All right, let's not get ahead. So now we've got a primitive workforce that's going to be spawned off from the remnants of Noah and his family. They're the only ones that survived. And they wouldn't have survived had it not been for Enki interceding multiple times and then finally telling his brother Enlil, who was trying to make them all go away, that look, the floods just happened. You wiped them all out. Atrahasis is my son. And I say we let him live because there's not going to be any primitive workers here to grow our food or serve us if we make him go away too. And Enlil must not have been real astute on that. Either he knew they'd achieved their milestones in the gold mines and they didn't need them anymore, or he was just looking to make sure the genetic offspring from his brother, who was clearly much brighter than he was wanting to make them just go away. And I think there was a little of both. The idea that these genetic offspring were being enslaved to serve them, I think that violated galactic law. I think Enki knew that, and he was trying to figure out how to imbue these beings with something to make up for that, something that would allow them to have the same experience that they did, because he knew it was wrong to enslave them. And in his writings, when you read them, he talked about that. He felt like, this was a very difficult fate and destiny decision for him to use his intellect to do that. And when you see that he was wrestling that way back then, now fast forward to GMO modifications, building nuclear weapons, all the things that we can do, but we need to stop and ask ourselves, should we be doing that? And it's the same thing he was asking himself way back then. So very honorable traits from somebody who was trying to help us versus this other being was like, well, just make them all go away. They're so subservient barbarians. We designed them to be primitive workers, and you want them to be something else in that? You want them to have consciousness and know the difference between good and evil? What do you want them on my staff? Is that what you're doing? So from Enlil's standpoint, he felt like he was being incurred upon by Enki. And it shows up in their brutal relationship and just two half brothers that didn't get along, and they didn't see the world the same way at all.
I always remember them, Gerald. I always remember Enki as the moral scientist and Enlil as the baddie, the psychopath. That's how I remember them.
Well, he reminds me of some of the people I see in the Pentagon in a way. It's like,
sure.
We don't care about anything else. We've got the big hammer, and look out there. There's a big nail. There's a little nail. There's a tack. Whatever it is, I'm going to hit it with a hammer. And it's like this. It's like when you watch Hercules and how he was portrayed as this kind of, I don't know, bully, not very smart, constantly showing off his strength capabilities, but he never really was very smart. Reminds me of the offspring. It must have been Enlil. Because when I read the lies he tried to tell in the Bible to make himself the only God, he did not do a good job.
Sure.
He didn't do a good job.
I know.
Tense change problems, using Boolean violations of the absolute, blah, blah, blah. Any scientist that would read this go, what? And I bring out some of that in the book. Okay. So I hope we've kind of come from Nibiru, got through all the main players, Enlil, Enki, Ninhartsog, and then the seminal son, which was Ningshita. And I like him because he's like us, James. He was like He was like an engineer. You know, he was the one that didn't get credit. He was in the lab doing all the work.
He's the hard working guy in the background.
But he was the one that was beaming brilliance from behind the closed door, but never got put on the stage.
Let me interject there, Gerald. What I remember about the start of the book, you talk about Ningshita may have encoded triggers in this genetic hybrid, and I really like that idea, Gerald, because I can see that happening. If we take this whole
you see it, I see it as well.
If we take if we take this whole Sumerian account, okay, for what it is, and let's say this is all happening, this is all going on, there's got to be one guy in there who's going to go, well, look, let's give them a bit of something. Let's get these guys. Why not? I don't want to make a robot. I wouldn't want to make a robot. I would want to make a guy to give him a fighting chance, give him a little bit of a chance to, to evolve.
That's the interesting part. You can tell now if you examine DNA that essentially it's a lexicon. When a lexicon is a rule set and how you put together symbols so that they make some sense, just like our language. So DNA is a language. And what's interesting, it's only composed of 4 characters. So you ask yourself, how many ways can you permute 4 characters to create sequences and such that they manifest RNA, DNA, and chemicals compose our body? So it's an interesting question to ask. And then you find out that in addition to that, a large part of it is not understood, so we label it junk. Well, now recently with all the DNA studies, they've actually figured out that 95% is not junk. It's got a meta lexicon sequencing function that controls the protein sequencing down at the lower level. So you got a layered, nested program that is so sophisticated that you realize only somebody who writes software code would understand how to predicate such a thing. And I don't know about you, but I've written a lot of code in a lot of different languages. And when I saw this and read Timothy Leary's discussion about these latent programming circuits that seem to be triggered in all humans, for instance, he mentioned 8 different circuits. I don't know if you were aware of these.
Wow.
And we can go through them if you want.
Sure.
But I think they're extremely interesting. And I don't want to take this off of the Anunnaki story too much, but the idea of having a DNA trigger is really fascinating to me, because you realize what a brilliant engineer Ningshita was when you read these accounts. He had the same knowledge his dad did. And I think he possibly even took it farther. So in the Garden of Eden, the carrier of the caduceus was Enki. That was a symbol for a geneticist. Okay.
Yeah. The caduceus, yeah.
That symbol got handed to his son. So all of a sudden, now you see Ningshita, Thoth, Hermes, Mercury's running around with this symbol everywhere. Okay.
So
there was a transfer of power, what I'm telling you, from father to son, and that shows up in the Emerald Tablets.
Almost like an army general taking off the badge off the jacket and handing it to the next in kin.
Well, they did that. So when a son inherited a kingship from the father, not only did he take on his name, but he took on all the attributes of the other entities that were below him at that rank. For instance, when Marduk became the head of the council in about 2000 BCE, he took on the rank of 50, Lord of the Earth. Actually, he took it by force, it seems like. But he was in line to rule. Let me think about it. No. He was Enki's firstborn son, so he was not born of him and his half-sister, who was Isis. That was the problem for him. Mm-hmm. But he was the firstborn, just like Enki was. So he took over he actually smote the Enlilites, got them out of Mesopotamia, and ended up in the head of the council for a while. Okay? He took it away from Enlil, the commander. Now think about what power he must have had to be able to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
You had to be able to raise an army and be just as destructive as he was to go do that. And I don't think Enki was a big proponent of war after you look at how he described his relationship to Atrahasis, his son, in dealing with these destructive incursions. He was more like Gandhi. He taught passive resistance techniques versus, just fighting with a gun. He was a lot more evolved than that, it seems. Okay. So this idea of this caduceus is very important. And the idea of him being a geneticist and possibly somebody able to write computer programs, now that you realize how sophisticated they were. Listen, you think they didn't have a simulation of the constellations and all life forms to determine what the state space was, so they had a sensor fused view of the whole environment they were operating in? Of course they did. We would do it today. Sure. Look at we have Google Earth where we can go in a 3D model and visit anywhere on the Earth. Do you think they didn't have anything as sophisticated or more? Of course they did. Sure. Well, keeping that in mind, Dr. Leary introduces some latent circuits that seem to be triggered by various things in our life. And I'll give you a couple for instances, unless you want to go all through them. There was a biosurvival circuit. It's imprinted by the mother or mothering object, and it's subsequently conditioned by either nourishment or threat. So that's your very lowest level one, biosurvival. Then he talks about an emotional territorial circuit. It's imprinted when the infant stands up, walks around, begins to struggle for power in the family, for structure or hierarchy. Wow. Yeah, pretty interesting. Well, so you can go to the age that a child is and start looking at these circuits and go, is that happening? Is that happening like he said? Here's the next one. Time-binding semantic circuit. It's imprinted by human symbol systems. Symbols, very important. And artifacts. This is what controls the local paradigm. So if you start showing a human a bunch of symbols, apparently it triggers this and starts waking them up. Now, is that why all the symbols are put out in the public for us? So it's to wake us up? Possibly. Number 4, socio-sexual circuit. It's imprinted by the first orgasm mating experience and also by tribal taboos. It processes sexual pleasure, definitions of right or wrong, reproduction, parental rules, and the raising of young. Okay, so now if you know that circuit is triggered and you go expose it to the family guy in this culture, what do you think is going to happen? Especially when they're younger than when they should be exposed to this. Are you trying to create sex slaves in the culture? Sure looks like it. Mm-hmm. Neurosemantic circuit. It's imprinted by ecstatic or spiritual experience. Okay. Wow. Now think about this also. Are these latent DNA sequences possibly related to the energy and quantized levels in your consciousness that are that this caduceus symbol represents? Very possibly. Okay. The next one is the collective neurogenetic circuit, which contains our entire evolutionary script covering the past, present, and future. Could that be our junk DNA that nobody's talking about? This circuit state was referred to by Carl Jung as the collective unconsciousness. And it's also affiliated with the distinct archetypes. Now, when you get to this level that you're having archetypal discussions about the hero's journey and all that, like I did in my book, that wakes people up, that circuit, at a very different level. So if you put your eyes on something that exposes you to these archetypal distinctions that Enki created, it looks like it triggers another circuit. Okay, Let's keep going. The next one, number 7, is the meta-programming circuit. And this appears to be the realm of conscious reprogramming and re-imprinting of the other circuits. So this is the level where personal development programs have a good effect. Okay, so this is pretty far along, and this is the where the individual consciously chooses to re-imprint the unconscious mind through the application of symbols and internal imagery. Now, keep that one in mind, as I mentioned in my book, that every seeker on this path ought to take a look at the 17 breath or 18 breath if you're far enough along Merkaba meditation. It activates number 7. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then the last one is the non-local quantum circuit. And the operations here occur transpersonally beyond the ego. This is the realm of out-of-body and near-death experience.
Astral projection.
So your DNA, what I'm telling you, is an intentional design, a computer programming language, if you will, that can be activated by external triggers, many of which are either energetic or taken in through the visual system, which is symbolic. So that's interesting to know, isn't it?
DNA is so sophisticated, Gerald. It's so out there.
We just now we just now in the last 25 years started decoding DNA. I mean, we've gone all this time and had no idea what it was. So we're just so the newbies on the block relative to this
we're still finding out stuff with the language genes and everything we find. It's bizarre.
Yeah. Well, I want to give you kind of a heads up why I was attracted to some of these circuits. You know, my boy JJ was born with a genetic disorder called DeGeorge's syndrome.
Sure, we talked.
And he's missing part of the material off his 22nd chromosome. And the symptoms are quite severe. There's over 200 different anomalies that can happen to a child like this, and some of the worst ones are severe mental retardation and congenital heart defects. Well, my kid got all those. Okay, so he's a medical mess. But at the same time, in working with him and trying to establish communications with him, he doesn't speak or anything like that. Okay, and in doing so, I realized that there were certain somatic, symbolic, and various other things that he tunes into that establish a communication path for him. And so in my quest to find a way to break through to him, I tried lots of different frequencies of entrainment, different ways to stimulate him, you know. And in doing that, it really opened up my mind to the idea of cymatics. Are you aware of cymatics?
Cymatics, yeah.
It's CYMATICS.
Yeah, for sure.
And I found this interesting because I'd been one of those who had been following the particle physics zoo for many years, watching what was happening at Fermi Lab, what's happening at CERN, and the idea of finding, you know, the ultimate particle that's used in composing matter is interesting to me. And they think it's a Higgs boson, they think of it, whatever. Now go back to this account where Enki did this reverse exorcism and he's creating this. And the physics people are still trying to figure out how you take matter and compose stuff by reverse engineering using destructive means. Bash a couple of electrons together at light speed and see what happens, right?
Sound and geometry.
Well, on the other end of that spectrum is the creative spectrum that seems to have to do with going all the way back to this creator of all who spoke the word and segregated the heavens from the waters, you know. So the idea of a spoken word or a vibration is coming up, and it's very important. And if you start to look at vibrations now, you realize a vibration is similar to a waveform that's vibrating through space. So you realize that everything is a vibration, whether it's matter or sound or a microwave or infrared. They're all vibrations. There's different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, so the idea of this energy and matter connection was really, really important to me. I just lost where I was going with that too, by the way.
Well, the cymatics, the sound, the vibration,
cymatics.
Platonic solids.
Okay, so cymatics is very interesting in that sound looks like it was used by the creator all to establish the law of time. And you'll see that in my Emerald Tablet number 10. I did a deep dive on that for people. But it also seems to compose matter. And here's what we know. If you vibrate a drum head, if you will, and you put some particles on it, and you run it through a frequency sweep of a constant tone, all of a sudden you can see the material start to take on different forms, different geometric patterns. And this was always very interesting to me. I thought, you know, what's the relationship between vibration and structure? You know, it seems like crystals have a certain structure that put off certain energy that all these seekers are talking about, but at the same time they do funky things to light, you know, separating light into the visible spectrum or other things that properties of materials do with light that I find very interesting. Okay, so the idea that some cymatics could somehow be used to create form out of matter needed to be thought about even more, especially if the creator of all did it in the Emerald Tablets and in the Bible, right? So I started thinking a lot about that. How do you take energy and compose matter? And if you knew this, you'd get a Nobel Peace Prize because you'd have just solved the grand unification theory, which tries to bring together gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, and the strong nuclear force.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the four disparate energies that the grand unification theory is trying to bring together. Well, all of a sudden, if you go all the way back to the quote-unquote Big Bang, when everything happened, well, the Big Bang was a cymatic vibration, an eternal one issued by the creator of all. And he talks about this in the tablets, as Thoth asks what the law of time is to his teachers. Very, very, very deep, very deep. So the idea of cymatics was important to me relative to JJ, and here's why. We knew there was a lexicon in the DNA that properly specified like a computer program. If a computer program has an error in it, it won't even compile in the compiler, okay? You go, oh, you got an error in line 417. This variable is undeclared, or just whatever the problem is, right? So it's a very exact thing to use programming languages, because it has to map to exact synthesis to the constructs of the lexicon, or it fails. Well, so I started thinking, well, what about our DNA? It's clearly a program. Could it be reprogrammed dynamically? And this is what led me to my research in grad school. I was of the opinion that it only happened through this genetic mutation model that we had as we were modeling population dynamics. So the idea is in Darwin's theory that a parent populace has a progeny, has a little mistake in its DNA. That mistake turns out to be a good thing, a desirable attribute. The environment rewards it, and everybody that doesn't have it dies off. That's the model I understood. Mm-hmm. But when I got into grad school, I realized from my deep research there that model doesn't account for everything. There has to be dynamic changeability in an adult DNA vibe, given the environmental cataclysms we've seen. Otherwise, all life would be gone.
That's true.
So this led me to the idea that, and maybe I was just reaching for my son, that DNA could be changed, and it didn't have to happen in a zygote. It could happen during your life. So now all of a sudden I'm running across these latent circuits that we just went through, and the idea of a caduceus that's representing a transformation of energy with our DNA. And I got some hope that maybe cymatics was the key to helping my son JJ. And here's what I had in my mind. And if I get too deep in this, vector me elsewhere, okay?
Not at all.
But it's pertinent to the idea of where we go with this book.
For sure.
If you could take a frequency that you knew interacted with DNA and caused it to do something, relax, unwind, whatever, change in some way, you might have the carrier wave to be in communication with that organ. Guess what? We found what that is. It's 528 hertz. It causes DNA to uncouple for some reason. We don't know why.
Wow.
That's weird.
So
okay.
Sonic geometry, does it something to do with the frequency changing
exactly.
the geometry?
Well, this leads back to the Platonic solids. If you go back into Drunvalo Melchizedek's work, certain basic solids are used to create all matter that seem to show up when you do a cymatic vibration. So there's a connection. Mm-hmm. Cymatics uses the Platonic solids, and somehow, with the rules of the law of creation manager, can actually manifest matter from the periodic table of the elements. That's where E equals MC squared shows up. Energy and matter are related in that way. Energy can create matter. Matter can be destroyed, become energy. They go back and forth. It's an illusion. Matter is an illusion of energy, in my mind. As an electrical engineer, that's how I see it. Okay. So, back to JJ. What if you could cymatically encode the proper lexicon of DNA onto this 528 hertz carrier, like a radio signal, and expose it to JJ and see if you didn't see real-time changes in his DNA that showed up. And it's a total long shot, okay? And I know I'm reaching, and it's a research project to move the ball further along. But what do I have to lose?
God loves a trier, though, Gerald. God loves a trier.
Yeah. So what did I have to lose?
Nothing.
And I'd been doing my structural practice for 7 years after I left engineering, even though I still was doing consulting. And I was looking at human energy bodies. I was looking at structure, all the things that were a problem for my kid. He was in braces until he was 5. He couldn't walk. His relationship to gravity was awful. And so that was another reason why I got vectored down that path, is to help him. Well, what I learned from that ended up in this book, and I never would have got there had I not followed my omens. Okay, it's top of the hour. You want to?
Well, yeah. Let's talk. Let's come back into the book because we're going to talk about chromosomes and telomeres as well, and how telomeres.
I wanted you to have that background of energy and matter, and this little experiment I had in my mind about using cymatics to change JJ's DNA, so that maybe someday he could communicate with me. And I'm not ever going to give up. I don't care what circumstances he ends up in. He's 15 now. Okay.
The funny thing is, Gerald, I know the ancients had knowledge of somatics. If you look at Rosslyn Chapel, there's evidence that they had knowledge.
Exactly.
Not
this
only
goes
that,
all the way back to Egypt as well, and they were using energy inside these chambers that were very specifically designed to affect consciousness.
Also,
and who was doing that? It was Thoth. So that's so interesting to me.
Also, there's what we have in the British Museum. They have these Scottish balls. They were found in tombs and stuff. Ancient they are, and they're showing the Platonic solids, complex geometric shapes. And these things are ancient. I mean, they were carving these things in granite and showing the people, look, we know what Platonic solids are.
Well, now you understand that there's a relationship between cymatics, the Platonic solids, and the law of creation of matter. And we're sneaking up on that, okay? Because I want you to think about something before we go to break here. What is the most unmanifested energy? In other words, what energy has the most potential to become matter?
Frequency.
Is it a Higgs boson?
Oh, wow.
Is it a phonon, a photon, a muon, a meson? What is it?
Light.
And when you figure this out, you all of a sudden are looking at the holographic simulator design rules of the creator of all. That's where it gets really interesting to me.
Sure.
It's understanding the mind of God. This is what Albert Einstein wanted to do. That's what many scientists that did what they did were trying to understand the design rules of our physical reality given us by the great architect. Mm-hmm. Right? So let's think about that, and we'll come back to that.
Gerald,
after the break.
We'll go to break before we get into another discussion. We'll go to break at the moment, and I want to come back. We're going to talk about chromosomes and telomeres because this is back into the book again. Okay? We'll take a break. We'll be back in just a moment.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Hi, everybody. This is James from Capricorn Radio. Our today's author is Gerald Clark, and we are talking about his latest book, Seventh Planet Mercury Rising. I almost forgot the name of the book there, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
That's because you stayed up so long reading it to get ready for this. And I really appreciate that from you, James, that you're a good student.
Yeah.
And that makes good dialogues.
For sure.
You know?
There's so much in the book, Gerald. I could read it again and I'll get a totally different batch of information. It might take me to do that. I try to soak so much what's in there. Like I say, it's not complex or it's not difficult stuff. It's just there's so much in it. It is so. I'm not just talking quantity of pages. I'm talking about quality as well, Gerald. Quality and quantity.
Well, part of that is I decided to, in the discussion about Enki's design for us and the Ijiji replacements, and I talked about the energy body and a whole bunch of things like that. And before we get to all of that, I think the idea of their lifespans needs to be addressed because, for someone to say, well, that name shows up in this culture, but it also shows up as a different name in this culture. Well, they just made up a new name for God and it wasn't a real being. And that's why it's a myth, right?
Sure,
that's how it's been portrayed to us.
However, if these guys were geneticists, okay, they had to have cracked the genome for aging process, Gerald.
Well, if you could go back to the part where he was taking energy and putting it into a body, suppose they wanted to perpetuate their energy and take it out of their body and put it in another body. If they knew how to do it to someone else, did they not know how to do it for themselves? Of course they did. And this was discussed. There was a scene in one of the Sumerian documents. I believe it was out of one of Sitchin's books. I want to say the Lost Book of Enki. I don't remember. But there was Enki and his son Nagshita were off together, and they were having a discussion about. No, I'm sorry. It was Marduk. Marduk and his father Enki. They were having a discussion about capabilities, and Marduk felt like his father hadn't taught him everything like he had taught Nagshita, because he still didn't have the ability to animate and create and reincarnate life the way Ningshita did. And that was pretty telling, pretty interesting to understand that. So he was like the relationship to Enki through Enlil. He was kind of he wasn't really the scientist. He was more of a commander, if you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
More likely to be in politics or a bureaucrat, not in a lab. Well, Ningshita was just the opposite. He was more of a scientist that did bureaucratic functions when he had to.
Sure.
So let's go back to this aging thing. A couple of things caused me to wrestle with this. One of them, which is the report from the Anunnaki themselves, that they had been on a different planet, experiencing a different gravity level and different radiation level from the sun. They were in an outer orbit, not an inner planet orbit, except their planet occasionally, over long periods of time, came in close to the sun, and then they had to deal with the issue just like they were an inner planet relative to solar radiation.
Radiation, yeah. Solar flares.
The periodic peaking of the sun cycle every 11 years, and coronal mass ejections, and all those things that happen with the sun. Well, it affects the inner planets far more than it does the outer planets with that level of radiation. So that was an issue for them. When they came into close perihelion, it was an issue. Well, now think about that. If you go onto another planet, you're experiencing a different gravity level, different radiation level. Is it possible that the aging of your material construct in that order of reality is going to experience what we call aging based on that situation? So if you're close to the sun, going around the sun really quickly every 365 days versus every 3,600 years, maybe it's affecting the local life cycles more than we know. So in general, the question is, if you have a life form on a planet that's at various distances from the sun, what does it do to their aging process? And then you have to define what aging is, okay? And that's what we just been zeroing in on as we talk about DNA. That in 2009, some researchers, and I put this in the first book and my second book, it was so important, had discovered what the laws of aging are in their body.
Oh, yeah.
All the way down to the DNA level. And this has to do with the telomeres.
Telomeres and aging,
so, yeah. And so it looks like certain damage is done to the end caps of your DNA, these double helix strands that come together. There's these little, think of it as a shoelace, and it's got a little cap on the end where it keeps the shoelace from unraveling, right? Well, that's kind of like what a telomere is on the tip of your DNA.
A Flugelbinder.
And apparently, go ahead.
A Flugelbinder is the name of the end of the, would you believe? Hang on, Gerald. Would you believe I did a show? Would you believe I did a show? Would you believe I did a show on Monatomic Gold with Spencer Cross, and he asked the same thing about this. He described the same thing, and I said Flugelbinder.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you get down to the DNA level what the various elements from the periodic table do. And if you've been exposed to alchemy, which is one of the oldest sciences on the planet, came from the being Al-Chem. Okay, well, the land of Chem was Egypt, and you read my book, you realize this is Thoth. He was the first alchemist. Okay. Anyway, so telomeres. Let's get back to telomeres. So these little end caps on the end of your DNA, they can be affected by certain things such that they lose their consistency. They get damaged. What could damage them? Is it gravity or is it possible radiation from the sun?
Both.
It looks like radiation has an effect on our DNA.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's been lots of research into energetic interactions with DNA, and it's an area I'm focused on. It's probably a whole nother book, but it's relevant here. Okay. So if the telomeres on the end of your DNA, if they get damaged and the cell replicates, these telomeres predicate the replication process for the cell. And if they're damaged, then the cells are damaged when they reproduce from a damaged telomere. And the damage usually shows up in the telomere as shortening, typically shortening. Okay. So these scientists in 2009 figured out, well, what affects the shortening of DNA? And they know it and announced that it's the presence of this chemical called telomerase. If telomerase is in the proper quantity in your body, then the telomeres don't shorten. Mm-hmm. And that's amazing. Well, all of a sudden, if they're not shortening, you're not aging. And it appears that the Anunnaki were aware of that. And Nin Hartzog, who was their medical officer, was actually the focal point of bringing up this problem of aging faster on a planet that sits in the inner orbit around the sun versus an outer planet. And so she compared her aging state with one of the peers that she went to school from, and he basically pointed out to her, now imagine telling a woman this: hey, I went to school with you, and you've sure aged a lot more than I have. Yikes. That's just not something you'd tell a woman, okay? But he told her this because they were classmates. Sure. And she was a medical officer, and she set out about to do something about it. So the Anunnaki were experiencing this aging problem that all of us are continuing to experience now, but don't have the requisite knowledge to deal with it, unless you know about telomeres. So the generic issue is, if you could come up with whatever precursor is that generates enough telomerase in your body, you won't age. Is it food? Is it a drug? Is it a chemical? Is it something from the periodic table of the elements? You ought to start asking that. Well, we got clued into what it was because of what the Anunnaki were doing. First of all, yeah, we're gathering gold to go put it in the atmosphere, but they were also consuming something that looked like a white talcum powder that was formed into a bread cake back in Hathor's temple. Now, Hathor was the Egyptian name for Inanna. Inanna is in my genealogy table, and you'll see how she fits into things. I kind of view her as an Enlilite. She came from Enlil's side of the family.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
And that's not to disparage her. It's just that she's the offspring of Enlil in his lineage.
That's not her fault.
No, not at all. So, sure. And oftentimes the Enlilites and the Enkyites interbred. As a matter of fact, the being whose perspective I'm taking all through this book, Ningshita, Thoth, Mercury, he named himself after the planet Mercury in the Enuma Elish, where his name there was Mumu. That meant the planet Mercury. So he was known as Mumu.
Wow.
Kind of a funny name back in the Enuma Elish. But Mercury was seminal to the Enuma Elish. That's why it came up. Hold on a second. I'm going to get a drink. Okay, am I back? So, the idea that gold could be related to aging is where we want to go. Sure. So they were consuming these bread cakes in Hathor's temple.
Mufkut. I think Lawrence Gardner called them Mufkut.
Yeah, Lawrence Gardner talked about this in the Genesis of the Grail Kings. So they actually got some samples of this white powder, and they had a lot of it on Mount. Excuse me. They found a lot of it under the temple floor there on Mount Sinai. Well, this is important because this is the mountain where Moses went up and got his 10 tablets in Exodus 32, 19, and 20. Very important read there, by the way, for Bible scholars to understand this relationship of gold to the spiritual path. So, what we know about gold and silver and the transition metals, what were they doing with this stuff? How did they turn it into a powder, and why were they consuming it? And what's the relationship to telomeres? So, one thing led to another as I did a deep dive on monoatomics and what they were producing. And it turns out from alchemy that if you melt gold in a furnace, it's going to get liquid. It doesn't turn into the powder that Moses spreads on the water in Exodus 32:20. Okay, you got to add something to it, and that something shows up in the Lost Book of Enoch, and that's the discussion by Azazel over antimony. Antimony is it's element number 51 on the periodic table of the elements.
Highly
And it turns
prized.
out it's the secret ingredient that when mixed with gold will cause it to turn into this white talcum powder.
Mm.
Now, so this monoatomic powder, or whatever this is the secret to why they were consuming it. What's a monoatomic? Well, and they occur naturally in nature. And I'm going to tell you a little story to make this real. I met a guy, and I'm going to say his name because I really like him, and I want him to hear his name on radio because he's a great guy. His name's Rick Selinsky. And he invited me up to Northern California where there's lots of gold. You remember the gold rush in California, right? Same area. And he has filed a claim, a very large one, that he's been mining for several years up in the mountains there, okay, near Truckee. And I won't tell you exactly where. I don't want to cause anybody to come up there and cause him problems. Because listen, I'm going to tell everybody right now, if you think you're going to go incur on someone else's mining claim, expect to take an army with you because they are very prepared for you.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Just know that. Okay. So anyway, he invites me to go look at his claim because he's read my book and he realizes I'm talking about monoatomics. Well, it turns out he's been running into these things significantly out in nature. They occur naturally. You don't have to run it through a process for this to happen. Think about gold and silver and the transition metals being, coming up through a volcanic fissure somewhere and then being exposed to water and limestone and acids and leaching it out and ending up in a pond or a puddle inside a cave. This is possible, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So in that idea of the Ponce de Leon fountain of youth, there's some real science behind it. And here's what it is. If you end up with something like gold or silver or platinum, and there's several items in the platinum group. There's like 6 of them, like palladium and a whole bunch of weird names that I can't even pronounce right now. But if you go to the periodic table of elements, you can see that. Well, what's special about these transition elements, these metals, is that when exposed to certain processes, they can be broken down to a very simple element, a diatom, which means 2 atoms that are attracted with an opposite charge. Mm-hmm. One's a positive, one's a negative. Mm-hmm. And certain acids that have lots of positive ions, like hydrogen ions, okay, these are very acidic. When introduced to a diatom, it can break it apart. So, for instance, if you have some salts in your water, the positive ion from the diatom, if it gets broke apart, this covalent weak bond with a strong acid, all of a sudden it can reattach to things. So now you got a positive ion that may be attached to a salt, and the negative ion might be attached to the hydrogen ion that caused it to break apart in the first place, right? So now all of a sudden, what I'm telling you, you got these little floating monoatomic elements that may be only attached to a weak salt that can be easily broken, and all of a sudden you have a single positive ion floating around. Why does that matter? Monoatomic elements have a very unique property of superconductivity. That's why.
Wow.
So if you could build something out of a monoatomic element, it won't cause any heat to be stolen away from electrons as they're traveling through a wire, for instance. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's law of conservation of energy without any law. It's a lossless system. That's amazing.
As an engineer, we both appreciate what that means. To have a lossless system is like...
So you start looking at this area of 0-point energy and trying to figure out how to get energy out of the environment like Tesla did. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? A superconductive element that works at room temperature is the key. And now you see graphene coming out that you can basically take graphene on a piece of paper that has 2 different nodes on it, a positive and negative, like a battery, put it up in the air, measure the resistance or the voltage across it, and as a function of the height you raise the paper up, it's changing. All of a sudden, you're taking electricity out of the air and you can translate it into a battery. And that's happening. That's happening on lots of fronts. Okay. So I'm really excited about seeing that come out of monoatomics. It's really, it's gonna free up mankind from buying their electricity through wires and the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So can we take this monoatomic gold and fix their DNA? Is it that simple, or is it?
Well, that's the interesting thing about these periodic table of the elements. What do we know about our bodily constructs relative to silver, gold, and all the elements of the periodic table? We're composed of the same elements in our body. How does energy create us from that template? You see what I'm saying? So this is where it gets very interesting in the field of alchemy. And this is ancient knowledge of understanding the alchemical principles that relate these periodic table of the elements to our body. Okay. So the idea of copper and silver and gold and how they get used to fight aging or other things in the body is significantly interesting. So the field of alchemy, to me, we kind of just ended up sneaking up on it. We didn't mean to, but it was unavoidable when you get to this level of knowledge. And then you find out that the first alchemist was Thoth teaching this knowledge.
Sure.
And to tie another point together, going back to the last book of Enoch, the being in that book who disclosed the idea of metallurgy and antimony to people was just lambasted, right?
Yeah.
It's like Prometheus being killed for giving mankind fire. Anything that potentially raised mankind's consciousness from one of the benevolent Anunnaki, they usually got wiped out for it.
Put down.
I give you Asclepius in the sign of Orpheus. He was apparently sharing his knowledge of eternity, one healer to another, probably about monoatomic gold, if I had to guess. And he was killed for it by Zeus.
Monoatomic gold wouldn't be the only reason these guys wanted gold, though, Gerald, would it?
No. Well, we talked about that. They obviously wanted a powdery suspension that they could spray in their atmosphere as a radiation shield. Well, a monoatomic powder would be just the thing to do it with, right?
Sure.
Spray it. It's very fine, like talcum powder. It's that fine.
It's that fine.
So if you spray this up in the ionosphere and it's doing its thing, listen, gold's a great radiation shield. And any of the other transition metals would do the same thing. It just so happens that gold doesn't corrode compared to some of the other ones. So
it's the best
one. The other alchemical reference from the periodic table of elements that's interesting to me is mercury. So you got antimony, gold, silver, and mercury and copper. And mercury is the most mysterious one of all.
Oh yeah, mercury is
the fact that it's
exotic.
A liquid metal, can turn into a vapor, can absorb any metal, doesn't have its own color, it reflects anything around it. It's the perfect symbol of alchemical transformation. Huh? I think that's why the being chose it, to affiliate it with it. That was Mumu in the Enuma Elish. His planet was Mercury, and it was Hermes in Greece, and Mercury in Rome, and Thoth in Egypt, and Nshita before that, and many, many, many other names. So, we talked about the telomeres and aging. So let's go to a couple of instances of that and see if this could be real. In Genesis 5:32, talks about Enoch's age and all the other progenitors from Adam to Noah. Just prior to 532, Enoch was just one of them.
360 years, I think he lived.
Pardon?
360 years, I think he lived.
365.
365. Sorry, that's right.
Yeah, Lamech lived 777, and I think he was the one-armed bandit creator. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
That's a lucky number when you win a jackpot. 777, right?
Yeah.
He lived 777 years. How interesting.
Wow.
Methuselah lived the longest. He lived 969 years, right? And then you get down to Noah at the last of the end, and I think he was 900 something years he lived. Well, he was the king of Shuruppak when the flood came, and that was after 600 years. So he was at least 600 years old when the flood came. You with me?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of all this tying together, Gerald. I mean, we have the
Well,
book.
now let's really make your head spin around. Let's go to the Sumerian Kings list and look at Enki's first city is listed there in the Sumerian Kings list, the city of Eridu. Okay, the first king was mentioned there, and it's a special circumstance in the Sumerian Kings list because it's the first king on earth. So there's a little discussion about now kingship's going to be lord of the earth and the first king. All right, that whole prelude is very seminal because it was the first time an Anunnaki being was allowed to run a kingship on the planet. That happened in Enki's first city, Eridu. And his name was Alulim. And he served for 8 shars. Now we know in the Enuma Elish and in the Atrahasis, a shar was their period for a year, which was 3,600 of our years. So 8 years is not very long of a rule for them as a king. But to us, you take 8 times, excuse me, you take 8 times 3,600 and you end up with 28,800 years.
Wow.
That's how long he ruled. Not how long he lived, how long he ruled. And if that's not enough for you in the city of Eridu, as the kingship moved from there to, I think it was Bad Tabira. Excuse me, I got a frog in my throat.
Sure. I'm just thinking what the Assyriologists... I'm just thinking of the Assyriologists. What did these guys think of the Sumerians Kings list and the Book of Genesis and the Book of Enoch on all these longevity?
Talking about Bible scholars and historians? They made it all a myth to make it go away.
It's called
mythology.
mythology.
Let me finish up one other. In the being in Bad Tabira, which was the Anunnaki Metallurgy Center in Mesopotamia, you realize, served for 12 shars. Wow. Do the math. That's over 40,000 years he ruled. So Methuselah got the longevity award from Adam to Noah at 969 years. That ain't nothing compared to the guys over on the Sumerian Kings list, right up to the point where the flood came. Now, this is also interesting. The first 8 rulers, starting from Alulim, all the way to Noah's flood, which is described in the tablets. There was a big break between the Sumerian kings of the first rulers to where it resumed. So after the first 8, they had ruled for 176,500 years. You can add up their rules, their reigns, right out of the table. 8 of them did that. Okay, and then the last one was when the flood came. Okay, and that's when Noah was the king, who was the Sudra. Okay, so he was a Sumerian king in essence. Now, excuse me one more time.
Sure.
I give his parental line in the book. It's very interesting. So we know Atrahasis' father was Enki, and his mother was Batana. She was a primitive worker like us. So it starts to bring up this idea of genetic dumbing down of the original Anunnaki source and what it does to your lifespan. So we've got a couple instances of that through history where the beings knew that and wanted to do something about it. And that was Gilgamesh, as an example.
I have a copy
he knew that he wasn't pure Anunnaki, and he sought out Utnapishtim, who was Noah, so that he could find out how it was he got an eternal life. His peer king, he's the king of the city of Uruk, and Atrahasis is the king of the city of Shuruppak, just down to the south. So the kings are probably clearly in communication with each other about what they know at the highest levels, just like they are now.
While we're on all the different kings and all the different rules, Gerald, it seems to be each guy gets his hands on the throne, destroys the old city, and he creates a new city, and you see the shift of power.
Well,
it's like
if you look at the Sumerian kings list, you have to ask yourself, in the first 8 kings, they served 176,000 years without looking like their terms were interrupted in any way, shape, or form, because there was an even number of shars, okay? There's sars, with however, like 8 sars or 12, whatever. You get down after the flood, and you start looking at the Sumerian kings list, it's very different. The kingship is jumping around like crazy. Like, for instance, the kingship in the city of Ur, which is very important because it was the capital of Sumeria twice, at least twice, and it was destroyed. And then in the Sumerian kings list, it goes, well, and the kingship was defeated and it moved over to Adab or Bad Tabir or whatever. Just no evidence or understanding of why this happened after the flood versus before the flood. They're serving massive rulerships. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Just go look at it. Like, for instance, in the second dynasty of Ur, Nanar-Sin was the king, and his wife was there with him. I think her name was Ningal in the story. Mm-hmm. And I put this in chapter 3. And, are you still there?
I'm here, yeah, I'm listening. Wow,
I just heard a click.
I'm here attentively.
Yeah, so this was called one of the Lamentations of Ur. And there were lamentations of other cities too. And a lament is like a funeral dirge. You're complaining about what this terrible thing just happened. Okay,
a lamentation of sorrow. A lamentation of sorrow.
Exactly. And I'm talking pitiful sorrow. Yeah. So in this second dynasty of Ur, when you call him Nani or Nanar, that's Nanar-Sin. And you read the account, he tells you his name, and that he's talking to his father, Enlil, okay? Mm-hmm. He's crying out about his city being destroyed. And then I started putting two and two together, like, Enlil says something in that account where he goes, well, no kingship has ever seen its come to fruition where it rules the whole term. And I thought, what a thing to say. Is that why the Sumerian kings after the flood are just going boom, boom, boom? They're just jumping from city to city to city. And all this carnage and death is going along with it. And I'm thinking, why? What's going on? If you read the Lamentation of Ur in my book, mm-hmm. or worse yet, listen to the audio portion, I challenge you not to be so emotionally disturbed. You're almost at tears. Yeah. About what happened to the people there. It's very disturbing.
And it is.
Including the father did to his son. It's even more disturbing.
Yeah.
So
it's like all these.
Looking at that. Go ahead.
Sorry, it's like all the different destructions of all the different. It's like there's a bunch of middlemen fighting for scraps, or it's like.
This wasn't middleman. This particular one was very telling. There was a council meeting, and Anu was there, and Enlil was there, and his two kids were there talking about the destiny of this city. And when it was decreed that it was going to be no more, the decree was rejected by the queen of that town. Mm-hmm. She said no. She's like, what are you talking about? You're not going to... Why have you destined this destructive dolor for me? And wow, it's just very telling. Well, without getting into all that, what I want you to walk away with is whatever was happening to these Sumerian kings after the flood, when Enlil was now in charge of the Mesopotamian region where all of them were, mm-hmm. you'll start to see that spirit of destruction and why this happened. And it is like you will recognize as a evolved being that the nature of this being is very severe. And now you start thinking, well, wow, does creation and destruction really have to be in balance? Because it's happening to these material bodies that we call people. He's recycling them like they're rocks through a black hole.
For sure.
And this is where it gets frightening for me, okay? Mm-hmm. And I'm still to this day wrestling with this, it appears if we look around, the balance of creation and destruction is way out of balance. Destruction is reigning supreme.
Yeah.
Look at the headline.
It's like we're talking about modern times here. It hasn't really
exactly.
It's
not changed at all.
For sure. Gerald, I think we're going to wrap it up with that because I've got to get you back. We haven't even scratched the surface. I'm going to get you back for another episode.
We're not even out of the first chapter yet. But laying this background, when we come at this again and we start bringing up some of the models I sent you and such.
This is the crux of the book for me, Gerald. This is why I was so excited about the second book you wrote, because that's what you do, Gerald. You provide models to break this all down, to assimilate all the data, and I think you do. You synchronize.
Well, don't you? You're an engineer. When you get a great concept Gerald. That you don't know how you're going to create it or how it's going to fit together with other pieces of an architecture, you have to have a model. Yeah, well, actually, not everybody does. I went to school with some people at UCSD that had such a gifted mind. They could be given a complex, very complex programming task and build all the models in their mind. And then when they sat down to start programming, it just came out first time. It's like, wow. You don't meet too many people like that. They are out there, truly.
Sure. But that's the thing. It's there's models, there's mind maps, there's tables, and you have to assimilate this evidence because it is a very complex.
Well, yeah, and what you just said is the scientific method, and that's what we're trying to do here. Listen, a fact is only a fact in a theory.
Yeah, for sure.
So you've got some evidence that you're putting together, hanging around a model, and asking yourself, does this make sense? That's all we're doing. We're not saying this is the absolute, but if you follow that method and it's repeatable for people, then they can recreate what you've done. That's the scientific method. And that's how I approach all data.
Hey, before we wrap things up, Gerald, did you see, just on the Caduceus symbol, there's a megalithic egg-shaped stone from 4000 BC found in South Portugal, and it's got it looks like the twisted serpent going around the central backbone. Have you seen?
Actually, that's so neat. There's so many symbols out in the public all over the world that remember these latent circuits I was telling you about.
Sure.
That was done intentionally to trigger those circuits to wake you up.
For sure. Mm-hmm. Gerald, give us out your website before we wrap things up, and I'm going to get you back soon to get into some more meat and potatoes here, but please give us out your website for the listeners.
Okay. It's www. Whoop. I'm going to leave that off because it rings. GeraldClark77.com. Now, I want people to know I'm kind of moving away from Facebook, kind of moving away from YouTube. I have a big presence there. But you can imagine with me saying what I'm saying, I'm getting cogs thrown in my wheel all the time. So I'm moving most of my communication with people to my website where I have a little more control. And that includes deep dives in my blog, discussion of models and things like that. And you're not going to see me doing that on Facebook, trust me. Although my blog does share up to my Facebook page, which is Gerald Clark. And my YouTube channel is Gerald Clark as well. So if you go to my website, I have those social media buttons that give you a link over to all that. Okay?
Wonderful. Again,
I look forward to real seekers coming into my inner circle and conversing with me. I'm not looking for naysayers. I'm looking for yay-sayers. That doesn't mean you have to swallow the whole pill and believe it. I'm looking for positive contributions to a model that can be verified. If you're coming in thinking you're going to tear my models down and try to puff yourself up as a sycophant, I'm going to drop kick you completely to the curb. Don't come. I'm telling you. Okay?
For sure.
Now,
Gerald,
let's end this on a positive note. The positive note is, even though we appear to be changing an old paradigm with what we've been taught, the reality is the new paradigm is the bomb. So as soon as you figure that out, it's the utopia, and that's what we all want.
For sure. Hey, I'm all on for a utopia, and I don't know if it's attainable, but I'll have a good go. Gerald.
Well, listen to you, my Irish brother. You stick with me, and it will be attainable, not for you, but you're going to convey it to the world in a way where they get it too. I'm going to make sure of that. Okay? Sure. That's my commitment to you.
Thank you, brother. Well, listen, the book we've been talking about is The Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising. The author's name is Gerald Clark. His website is geraldclark77.com. Get a copy of this book. Don't forget, it's available on Kindle, and it's available as an audiobook. I recommend the audiobook. You don't have to do any work. You just press play and listen. So, again...
Yeah, well, just so you know, really something strange happened on the audiobook. I knew from my last experience that everybody was going to be asking for it as soon as I published. Well, imagine after publishing your book and you just get it out the door and you're like completely whipped. But now you got to read the whole thing in a way where you don't make any mistakes and do the audiobook. It's very trying. And because of that, it's quite large. It's it's a 588 page book, and it turned out to be 33 files that when you added them up the time, it came out to exactly 11 hours. And all of a sudden I'm like, 3 times 11 is 33. What is going on here? I couldn't have done that or tried that if I'd attempted it.
Wow.
I mean, 11 hours exactly. There's no seconds left over anything. And it's
33
exactly
files, 11 hours.
So that number 33 is coming up a lot for me lately. It used to be 7, but you know, think about the Masons and the 33rd degree and then it has to do with some other deep knowledge, and we'll talk about that hopefully on the next show.
For sure. Well, you got some definite synchronicity going on with some numerology there, Gerald.
And I'm recording them all too. It's a really important thing to do. As you get into my book, you realize I define the word interesting and how that relates to paying attention to symbols and omens and how you get out of this trap. So it's important.
Gerald, I thank you for your time today. I look forward to the next show.
I do too, and I love you, my Irish brother, and I look forward to doing more of these. Okay?
Take care, bro. Gerald with a new book.
Yeah, I actually said on the back cover, I said, this is the book you and I have been waiting for my introduction. And truly, I didn't see myself as a writer for the last couple of years. I was an engineer in transition. You know, I wrote a lot of technical stuff, but I didn't write for the lay public. It was all technical. Mm-hmm. So this book to me made me really feel like I was finally in a place where now I'm a writer and I'm enjoying it.
It always intrigues me, Gerald. It always intrigues me to know what makes that person become an author. What makes them pick up the proverbial pen as such. You know, what's the initiate to make them?
It's funny you bring that up. I was reading just recently about the nature of inspiration and how it's been viewed through generations. You know, where does it come from? Why is this person inspired? Right? They used to think it was inspiration only came from the gods in the ancient cultures. So writers and musicians that were inspired to create were attributed to their relationship with the gods. And it's funny. What I was going to say about being a writer, some people write continuously. They're publishing continuously to a magazine or what have you. But for me in this space, it's been very different that when it's time to write, I get inspired. Otherwise, I'm corroborating or whatever I'm doing in the back of my head, but I'm not writing. Mm-hmm. So I have to get to a place of clarity where it's ready to come out. And it doesn't happen overnight for me. It just, when it happens, it's like a fire hose and then it just comes out. so I'm kind of an intermittent writer that way.
I know exactly how you feel, Jerry. You know,
do you?
And that's the thing. I wanted to mention your engineering background because the engineers are creative people. They see the world. They take what the physicists tell us and they put it and they create things with the physics. And hi, everybody, and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your faithful host James, and I have a returning guest today, Mr. Gerald Clark. What a super interesting guy today's author is, and if you haven't heard the previous show with Gerald, you got to check it out. It's so detailed and so prolific. One of my favorite shows to date. We covered his first book, The Anunnaki of Nibiru. It's prolific in its research, well written, well rounded, so detailed. We're going to talk about his second book today, Mercury, a 7-planet Mercury rising. Just let me tell you a bit about Gerald if you're not aware of Gerald Clark. He's a graduate of the University of California, San Diego, and he holds an MSEE in electronic circuits and systems. He's a BS in computer engineering. This is all pertinent to what we're going to talk about today. He's the author of several papers in communications and electronics field. He's well known for his work in the San Diego high technology industry, and he's awarded several patents in the free space optical laser communications field. During the years 96 to 2002, he worked as a telecommunications executive. Gerald's business travels took him to various parts of the world, exposing him to a plethora of cultures, which then acted as a catalyst for his research into mankind's earliest technologies and accomplishments. These include the cultures of Mesopotamia, surrounding areas then also of Turkey, Egypt, Persia and Iraq. And this eventually led to the cuneiform inscribed tablets left to us by the Sumerians, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Of course, Gerald's interpretation, his own subjective experience of his research is just so prolific, and he has a gift of the intelligence to break all this down and relay it to the readers, the viewers, and the audience today. So without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Gerald. Welcome to the show.
Hey, James. It's really great to be here with my Irish-seeking brother.
Oh, great to have you back on the show, Gerald. Wow, here we take you from an engineering and a scientific perspective, and you go, hang on a minute, this is the history we've been given. Okay, let's go to the records. You take this then and you explore the profound cuneiform writings for what they are. You take the scientific engineering insight that you have and you apply it, and you go, well, and you break it down with clarification and verification, Gerald. It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
You like engineering tables, don't you? Everything's got to be there put in a table. Actually, there were more tables in my Anunnaki of Nibiru book than there were in the second book. You know, from all the planet mapping to the names and the Enuma Elish to the zodiac changed. Sure. You know, the God table. Actually, that God table turned out to be a real eye-opener for people, just like it was for me. Mm-hmm. Once you see a name that crossed multiple cultures and it went thousands of years, is either a carryover name or the real being lived that long. And when we found out these beings were mortal for all intents and purposes, it changes a lot.
Sure. People that haven't read the book, The Anunnaki of Nibiru, Gerald, let's warm up with the show. Let's talk about these guys. What is Nibiru, the planet, and then maybe just tell us who the Anunnaki were. And also we will refer to the other show we did on the Anunnaki of Nibiru. But let's warm up and explain who these guys are. Yeah,
we'll do a warm up, and I want you to understand what I did with this book, whose perspective I took, so you can kind of understand, and then you'll understand how my perspective of the Anunnaki. So I saw what Sitchin did in terms of identifying the Enuma Elish as a very seminal document. That if you could understand that, you could probably have a much better understanding of what's going on in our solar system now, if it was true. So I did a deep dive on the Enuma Elish and translated that for people. Of course, I let it get cold for about 3 days, and I started to review it for editing. I didn't recognize a lot of it. I was like, wow, did I write that?
Wow.
So for me, it's an inspirational process that is an unveiling to me as well. It's very unique and it's fun.
Sure. The thing I want to mention for the listeners, Gerald, you know, I got the pleasure of reviewing the Kindle, and I got the pleasure of reviewing the audiobook. And let me just tell this to the audience. To review the audiobook was an absolute joy, because all the work of reading was done for me. And not just that, that I could buy any audiobook and just listen to it, and that's fine, but I never get the audiobooks of the books that I want. I mean, there's audiobooks on the internet, yes, but to get an audiobook of alternative history, and to get one that the author has read himself, which, by the way, I want the audience to understand that when you hear the author who wrote the book, or write the book himself, you get his emphasis, his intonations. You know, you get the passion that he has, and that came through so much, Gerald. That's what I was waiting for. I was so excited with the audiobook when you
I did that on purpose, because I mean, I had the opportunity to hire a professional narrator to do it, and I'm going to redo my first book now that I'm more of less of a hack at getting rid of noise and all the kind of things. I've learned the tools after being in this space for a year. So that's next on my list for anybody who's listening. I just redid the edition of the Anunnaki of Nibiru with the nice paper that I had in this one, and so on and so forth. So it's getting a facelift right now, totally.
Sure.
Okay. And so that's gonna be really good. That book is still selling very well all around the world.
You know, the thing is, there's a lot of Anunnaki. Well, I don't know how many Anunnaki authors there is out there, if you want to call it that genre, Anunnaki authors. But for all the Anunnaki authors out there, a lot of them, they just regurgitate a bit of material. They don't put their own spin on it. I think it's very subjective to you, this whole Anunnaki history, Gerald. You can create things with the science, and, you know, they have an explosion of creativity, and as well as the logical, technical, analytical mind as well. So that's why I wanted to mention that background you have, Gerald. It's very unique that we have somebody like you in the alternative history genre, if you think that's fair to say.
Yeah, definitely an anomaly in this space. For 20 something years, I was a hardcore engineer, everything from, low level design as a design engineer, all the way up to running engineering teams for 7 years. So I kind of seen it from all different angles. And it's been an interesting path, especially when I look back retrospectively and see how certain things now impact what's coming out of my book. It's almost like it was crafted together by some grand design for this message to come out. And I think that happens to a lot of people as writers. They're essentially mouthpieces for a broader message, especially if the message is, of this nature.
I think that's a very key thing you said there, John. There is a message in this book. It's a very, very big message, Gerald, and it's an important message for humanity.
It surprised me as well. So when you write the way I do, it's kind of interesting. It's almost like people who do automatic writing. They put their pencil down, they write a whole bunch of stuff real fast, and then they look at it and go, "What just came out?" When I write, oftentimes it's like that.
For sure.
When I start writing, that's it. It's like I've been given my bread and water, and I'll sit there and get it done. And it goes all hours of the day and night. And by the time the smoke clears, after this book took me just under 4 months.
For sure.
I was well over 700 pages, and I culled it down quite a bit to get to 588. But
wow.
So for that to happen in such a short period of time, by the time I did that, then recorded the audio book, and many sleepless nights.